Imagine this. You are Eleanor de Montfort, barely 16 years old, standing in a cold stone chamber in the year 1347. Your wedding dress, heavy with embroidered silk that cost more than most peasants see in a lifetime, rustles against the rough floor stones as you tremble. Tonight is your wedding night, but the man waiting for you in the shadows isn't your only concern. Through the thick oak door, you can hear them gathering outside, their voices growing louder with wine and anticipation. Your new husband, Lord Geoffrey, approaches slowly, his eyes cold and calculating. Behind him, you notice movement in the shadows. They're already here. The witnesses. 6 noble lords, 2 bishops, the royal physician, and your own mother-in-law, all positioned around the chamber like vultures waiting for carry-on. This isn't just your wedding night. This is your examination, your trial, your public humiliation disguised as holy ceremony. The heavy wooden shutters creak as winter wind rattles the castle walls. Candlelight flickers across the faces of those who will watch, judge, and document every moment of what should be your most private experience. Your hands shake as you realize the truth. In medieval Europe, your wedding night isn't about love, passion, or even duty. It's about proving your worth as a wife through physical evidence that will be scrutinized, recorded, and used as legal documentation for the rest of your life. What you don't know yet is that this nightmare of public intimacy was a standard practice across medieval Europe. From royal palaces to merchant houses, wedding night verification was a legal requirement that transformed the most intimate moments of human life into theatrical performances. The consequences of failure weren't just embarrassment. They were annulment, exile, and social destruction. Think medieval people were sexually repressed? Think again. They made intimacy the business of everyone in ways that would horrify modern sensibilities. Your most private moments were public property, subject to witness testimony, medical examination, and legal documentation. The bedroom was a courtroom where your body was the evidence and failure meant losing everything you'd ever known. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to tell me where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected through time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The practice of wedding night verification emerged from the brutal realities of medieval marriage law. Marriage wasn't about love or compatibility. It was a legal contract that transferred property, established political alliances, and determined inheritance rights. But here's what made medieval marriage law uniquely terrifying. A marriage wasn't legally binding until it was physically consummated. Without consummation, there was no marriage. Without marriage, there were no inheritance rights, no political alliances, no property transfers. This created a legal nightmare where the most intimate act between 2 people became a matter of public record. Families who had negotiated marriage contracts worth thousands of acres and hundreds of serfs needed absolute proof that the union was legitimate. The stakes were so high that leaving consummation to privacy wasn't just impractical, it was legally impossible. Eleanor's situation was typical for nobility. Her marriage to Lord Geoffrey united 2 powerful families and secured a strategic alliance worth more than most kingdoms. The dowry alone included 3 castles, 200 serfs, and trade rights that would generate wealth for generations. But none of that mattered if the marriage wasn't properly consummated and witnessed. The preparation for wedding night verification began weeks before the actual ceremony. Professional witnesses were selected based on their social standing and legal authority. These weren't random observers. They were carefully chosen officials whose testimony would hold up in church courts and royal tribunals. Each witness had specific duties and responsibilities outlined in detailed contracts. The royal physician examined both bride and groom before the wedding to ensure they were physically capable of consummation. These examinations were clinical and degrading, with the doctor checking for any physical abnormalities that might prevent successful intercourse. The results were documented in official reports that became part of the marriage contract. Bishops provided spiritual authority for the verification process. They blessed the marriage bed, performed special prayers for fertility, and served as moral witnesses to ensure the consummation occurred according to church doctrine. Their presence transformed a sexual act into a religious sacrament, making the verification process a holy duty rather than voyeuristic entertainment. Noble witnesses represented the political interests at stake. Lords and ladies from both families attended to protect their investment in the marriage alliance. They were there to ensure that neither family could later claim the marriage was invalid due to lack of consummation. Their testimony would be crucial if inheritance disputes arose decades later. The chamber itself was prepared like a stage set for legal proceedings. The bed was positioned so witnesses could observe movement and hear sounds without being too close to the actual participants. Candles were placed strategically to provide adequate lighting for verification purposes. Fresh linens were laid specifically for the examination that would follow consummation. Eleanor's mother-in-law, Lady Margaret, had supervised similar verifications for decades. She knew exactly what evidence the witnesses needed to see and hear. The movement of bed curtains indicating vigorous activity, sounds from both participants suggesting genuine engagement, physical evidence on the linens afterward proving penetration had occurred. The psychological pressure on young brides was enormous. Eleanor had received detailed instructions from her mother about how to behave during the verification. She was expected to show appropriate modesty while also demonstrating willing participation. Too much resistance would suggest the marriage was forced and therefore invalid. Too much enthusiasm would mark her as wanton and unsuitable for noble marriage. The grooms faced their own pressures. Lord Geoffrey was 32 years old and experienced, but performance under such scrutiny was challenging even for confident men. The witnesses weren't just observing. They were evaluating his masculinity, his ability to control his bride, and his fitness as a political ally. Failure would destroy his reputation and potentially end his family's influence. The actual process of verification followed established protocols that varied by region, but maintained consistent elements. The bride and groom were formally presented to the witnesses as married couples ready for consummation. The bishop blessed their union and prayed for successful completion of their marital duties. The witnesses took their designated positions around the chamber. Privacy was maintained through heavy curtains around the bed, but these curtains were designed to reveal shadows and movement while concealing explicit details. The witnesses could see enough to verify that intercourse was taking place without witnessing the actual act in graphic detail. This balance between verification and modesty was carefully calibrated to satisfy legal requirements while maintaining some dignity. The sounds of consummation were considered crucial evidence. Witnesses listened for specific indicators that genuine intercourse was occurring. The creaking of the bed frame suggesting vigorous movement, breathing patterns from both participants indicating physical exertion, verbal expressions of completion when the act was finished. These sounds were more important than visual evidence because they couldn't be easily faked. Time limits added another layer of pressure. The witnesses expected consummation to occur within a reasonable time frame, usually within 2 hours of the formal presentation. Couples who took too long were suspected of experiencing difficulties that might invalidate the marriage. Those who finished too quickly faced questions about whether proper consummation had actually occurred. Eleanor and Geoffrey's verification lasted 3 hours. The witnesses heard clear evidence of multiple attempts at consummation, suggesting genuine effort from both participants. The physical evidence examined the following morning confirmed successful penetration and completion. The marriage was declared legally binding, and the political alliance was secured. But not all verifications ended successfully. Failed consummations led to immediate annulment proceedings that could destroy families and destabilize political alliances. The church maintained detailed records of failed wedding night verifications, revealing the devastating consequences when physical evidence didn't meet legal requirements. The morning examination was perhaps the most humiliating aspect of the entire process. The bride was subjected to a physical inspection by the royal physician and female witnesses to verify signs of defloration and consummation. This examination was conducted while the male witnesses waited outside, but the results were shared with all interested parties. The linens were displayed as evidence, with specific attention paid to bloodstains that indicated the bride's virginity had been intact before consummation. These bloodstains weren't just private proof, they were legal documents that would be preserved in family archives for generations. The absence of appropriate bloodstains could trigger investigations into the bride's previous sexual experience. The documentation process created permanent records that followed couples throughout their marriages. Detailed witness statements describing what they observed and heard during consummation. Medical reports confirming physical evidence of successful intercourse. Legal documents establishing the marriage as properly consummated and therefore binding under church and civil law. Regional variations in verification practices reveal how widespread and systematic these procedures were across medieval Europe. In France, royal marriages required verification by representatives from both the church and the monarchy. English noble families developed elaborate protocols involving multiple nights of verification to ensure conception occurred quickly after marriage. Italian city-states created verification guilds whose professional witnesses specialized in marriage consummation documentation. These guilds maintained strict standards for evidence gathering and charged substantial fees for their services. German principalities required verification witnesses to swear formal oaths before church courts, making false testimony a crime punishable by excommunication. The Spanish Inquisition used marriage verification records as evidence in purity investigations, examining consummation documents to identify families with Jewish or Muslim backgrounds. Portuguese maritime families adapted verification practices for long-distance marriages where consummation might be delayed by months due to trading voyages. Economic motivations drove the development of increasingly sophisticated verification procedures. Marriage contracts worth modern equivalents of millions of dollars couldn't be left to chance or privacy. Families invested enormous resources in marriage negotiations and needed absolute certainty that their agreements would be legally enforceable. Inheritance law created additional pressures for thorough verification. Noble titles, land holdings, and commercial privileges all depended on legitimate heirs born from properly consummated marriages. A marriage that could be challenged as invalid would throw entire inheritance systems into chaos, potentially triggering wars between competing claimants. The Church's position on marriage consummation created theological justifications for verification practices. Marriage was considered a sacrament that required physical completion to be spiritually valid. The doctrine of two becoming one flesh wasn't metaphorical. It required actual sexual union witnessed by appropriate authorities. Thomas Aquinas developed detailed theological arguments supporting marriage verification in his Summa Theologica around 1265. He argued that marriage without consummation was like a contract without consideration, legally meaningless under both divine and human law. His writings provided intellectual foundation for verification practices that would persist for centuries. The psychological impact on participants reveals how verification practices shaped medieval attitudes toward sexuality and marriage. Young brides developed complex strategies for managing the trauma of public examination while fulfilling their legal obligations. Some used meditation techniques taught by religious advisors. Others relied on alcohol or herbal preparations to reduce anxiety. Grooms faced different but equally challenging psychological pressures. The performance anxiety created by public observation led some men to seek medical assistance before their wedding nights. Physicians prescribed various treatments for what they called wedding night weakness, including dietary changes, herbal supplements, and techniques for managing stress. The witnesses themselves developed professional approaches to minimize the traumatic aspects of their duties. Experienced verification witnesses learned to maintain appropriate distance while still gathering necessary evidence. They created protocols for respectful observation that balanced legal requirements with human dignity. Training for verification witnesses involved instruction in legal requirements, medical knowledge, and social protocols. New witnesses accompanied experienced practitioners to learn proper procedures. They studied canonical law to understand what evidence would be acceptable in church courts. They received medical education to recognize signs of successful consummation. The development of specialized furniture and architectural features for verification purposes shows how thoroughly these practices were integrated into medieval life. Wealthy families constructed marriage chambers with built-in observation areas that provided witnesses with clear sight lines while maintaining some separation from the bed itself. Verification beds were designed with specific features to facilitate observation and evidence gathering. Curtain systems that could be adjusted to control visibility. Mattresses that would show clear evidence of activity. Linens and colors that would reveal bloodstains effectively. These weren't standard beds adapted for verification, they were purpose-built furniture for legal documentation. Castle architecture incorporated marriage verification requirements into the design of noble bedchambers. Rooms were sized to accommodate multiple witnesses comfortably. Acoustic features were designed to carry sounds clearly to observation areas. Lighting systems ensured adequate visibility for documentation purposes. The participation of religious authorities in verification practices created complex theological debates about the nature of marriage and sexuality. Progressive church scholars argued that verification violated the privacy that should surround the marriage sacrament. Conservative theologians insisted that public verification was necessary to prevent fraud and ensure legitimate heirs. Pope Gregory IX issued papal bulls in the 1230s that attempted to regulate verification practices while maintaining their legal necessity. His directives required that verification be conducted with appropriate dignity, and that witnesses maintain professional detachment. These regulations suggest that verification practices were becoming too invasive, even by medieval standards. Monastic scholars produced detailed guides for marriage verification that balanced legal requirements with Christian modesty. These manuals instructed witnesses on proper behavior, outlined acceptable evidence standards, and provided protocols for documenting their observations. The scholarly attention given to verification procedures reveals how seriously medieval society took these practices. The resistance movements that developed among some noble families show that verification practices were controversial even in their own time. Certain families attempted to negotiate marriage contracts that would waive verification requirements, though such arrangements were rarely accepted by other parties or church authorities. Alternative verification methods were sometimes proposed as compromises between privacy and legal requirements. Some families suggested that consummation could be verified through medical examination alone, without requiring witnesses to observe the actual event. Others proposed that verification could occur over multiple nights, reducing the pressure on any single encounter. The failure rates for marriage verification reveal how challenging these procedures were for participants. Historical records suggest that approximately 15% of noble marriages failed initial verification attempts, requiring multiple nights of observation before successful consummation could be documented. Failed verifications created immediate crises that required rapid legal and political responses. Families whose marriages failed verification faced annulment proceedings that could dissolve previously negotiated alliances. The shame associated with failed verification often led to permanent exile for both bride and groom. Medical intervention in failed verifications became increasingly sophisticated as physicians developed treatments for wedding night difficulties. Doctors prescribed various remedies for nervousness, physical problems, or incompatibility between spouses. These medical treatments were administered under witness supervision to ensure their effects could be properly documented. The social consequences of verification practices extended far beyond the immediate participants. Servants and castle staff became intimately familiar with the sexual lives of their employers through their involvement in verification procedures. This knowledge created complex power dynamics within noble households. Gossip networks spread information about verification results throughout medieval society, creating reputations that followed families for generations. Successful verifications enhanced family prestige and marriage prospects for other children. Failed verifications became family scandals that affected political standing and economic opportunities. Now that you've witnessed the systematic invasion of privacy that characterized medieval marriage verification, you're beginning to understand how completely different concepts of intimacy were in the past. If uncovering these buried truths about how power structures controlled the most personal aspects of human life resonates with your curiosity about real historical experiences, subscribing ensures you never miss these deep dives into history's most guarded secrets. The stories waiting ahead will challenge everything you thought you knew about privacy, marriage, and the relationship between personal autonomy and social control. The international dimensions of verification practices reveal how these procedures facilitated diplomatic marriages between different kingdoms and cultures. When Princess Margaret of England married King Louis VII of France in 1160, representatives from both royal courts attended the verification to ensure the political alliance would be legally binding under both English and French law. Cross-cultural verification created unique challenges when marriage partners came from different legal traditions. English common law emphasized different evidence standards than Roman civil law used in continental Europe. Islamic marriage law in Spain created additional complications when Christian nobles married into formerly Muslim families. The development of international verification protocols required diplomatic negotiations as complex as the marriage agreements themselves. Treaties specified which witnesses would be acceptable to both parties, what evidence standards would apply, and how disputes over verification results would be resolved. Merchant family verifications developed their own distinct characteristics as commercial wealth began challenging traditional noble dominance. Wealthy traders who married into nobility required verification procedures that satisfied both commercial law and noble customs. These hybrid verifications created new legal precedents that influenced marriage law for centuries. Banking families like the Medici developed verification practices that emphasized financial competency alongside physical consummation. Their marriage verifications included documentation of the bride's ability to manage household finances and the groom's competence in commercial negotiations. Sexual performance was still required, but it wasn't the only measure of marriage validity. Guild regulations created additional verification requirements for marriages within specific trades. Master craftsmen needed to demonstrate not only physical consummation, but also the technical skills required to maintain their professional standing. These professional verifications ensured that guild privileges would transfer appropriately to spouses and children. The role of women in verification practices was complex and contradictory. While brides were subjected to intimate examination and observation, experienced women also served as verification witnesses and advisors. Elderly noblewomen developed expertise in marriage verification that made them valuable consultants for other families. Female physicians, though rare, sometimes participated in verification procedures by conducting the medical examinations required before and after consummation. These women walked a careful line between providing necessary medical services and avoiding accusations of impropriety that could destroy their professional reputations. Maternal involvement in verification created emotional trauma that affected mother-daughter relationships for years after marriage. Mothers who participated in their daughter's verification often struggled with guilt about their role in the humiliation, while daughters resented maternal cooperation with degrading procedures. The training provided to young women in preparation for verification reveals how thoroughly medieval society prepared brides for public examination. Noble daughters received explicit instruction in how to behave during verification, what responses were expected, and how to manage the psychological stress of observation. Marriage preparation included detailed discussions of anatomy, sexual techniques, and the evidence that witnesses would be seeking. This education was far more explicit than anything provided to unmarried women, creating a stark divide between maiden ignorance and bridal knowledge. Religious instruction for verification focused on the theological significance of consummation, while providing practical guidance for enduring the examination process. Church advisors taught meditation techniques, prayers for strength, and spiritual frameworks for understanding verification as religious duty rather than personal humiliation. The development of verification ceremonies shows how medieval society ritualized and formalized the most intimate aspects of human life. These weren't crude observations by drunken relatives. They were carefully orchestrated legal proceedings with established protocols, formal documentation, and professional standards. Ceremonial elements included blessing of the marriage bed by religious authorities, formal presentation of bride and groom to assembled witnesses, recitation of prayers for successful consummation, and structured observation periods with designated roles for each participant. The aftermath ceremonies were equally formalized, with official examination of evidence, witness testimony recording, documentation preparation, and formal declaration of marriage validity. These procedures transformed sexual intercourse into a legal sacrament with binding consequences for all participants. Seasonal variations in verification practices reflected medieval beliefs about fertility, conception, and optimal timing for sexual activity. Spring verifications were considered most favorable because increased daylight was thought to enhance fertility. Winter verifications required additional planning due to cold temperatures that might affect performance. Astrological considerations influenced verification timing, as medieval physicians believed celestial alignments affected sexual compatibility and conception probability. Noble families consulted court astrologers to determine optimal dates for marriage verification based on planetary positions and lunar phases. Religious calendar restrictions created complex scheduling challenges for verification ceremonies. The Church prohibited marriage activities during Lent, Advent, and various feast days, requiring families to plan verification timing months in advance. These restrictions sometimes forced delays that created diplomatic tensions between families. The evolution of verification practices over time shows how these procedures adapted to changing legal, social, and cultural conditions. Early medieval verifications were relatively simple affairs focused primarily on confirming that intercourse had occurred. Later practices became increasingly elaborate as legal requirements became more sophisticated. Technological developments influenced verification procedures as improvements in lighting, furniture design, and medical instruments made observation and documentation more precise. Better candles provided clearer visibility. Improved bed construction reduced noise that might interfere with auditory evidence. Advanced medical tools allowed more accurate examination of physical evidence. Legal developments created new requirements for verification documentation as church and civil courts demanded more detailed evidence for marriage validity. Witness testimony formats became standardized. Medical examination procedures were codified. Documentation standards were enforced across different jurisdictions. The decline of verification practices began in the late medieval period as concepts of privacy and individual rights slowly emerged. Humanist philosophers questioned whether public observation of intimate acts was compatible with human dignity. Legal scholars argued that marriage validity could be established through less invasive means. Protestant Reformation challenges to Catholic marriage doctrine included criticism of verification practices as degrading and unnecessary. Reformed churches developed alternative approaches to marriage validation that emphasized mutual consent over physical evidence. These theological changes gradually reduced verification requirements in Protestant regions. Renaissance cultural changes promoted new ideals of romantic love and marital privacy that conflicted with traditional verification practices. Literature and art began celebrating intimate marriage relationships that excluded outside observers. These cultural shifts created pressure for more private marriage customs. Economic changes reduced the political importance of noble marriages as centralized monarchies decreased the power of feudal alliances. Marriages became less important for political stability and territorial control, reducing the necessity for elaborate verification procedures. Legal system development provided alternative methods for establishing marriage validity and inheritance rights that didn't require physical evidence of consummation. Improved record-keeping, standardized documentation, and professional legal services made verification redundant for many legal purposes. The psychological legacy of verification practices influenced European attitudes toward sexuality and marriage for centuries after the procedures themselves were abandoned. Concepts of marriage as public institution rather than private relationship persisted long after verification ended. Cultural memory of verification practices created lasting associations between sexuality and shame that affected how subsequent generations approached intimacy and marriage. The idea that sexual activity required external validation became deeply embedded in European consciousness. Legal precedents established during the verification era continued to influence marriage law and inheritance rights well into the modern period. Many contemporary legal concepts about marriage validity, consummation requirements, and spousal obligations trace their origins to medieval verification practices. Social stratification patterns established through verification procedures helped maintain class distinctions by creating different marriage standards for different social groups. Noble verification requirements emphasized the special status of aristocratic marriages while excluding lower classes from similar legal protections. The documentation produced by verification practices provides modern historians with unprecedented insight into medieval sexuality, gender relations, and social structures. These records reveal aspects of private life that would otherwise be completely unknown, making verification documents invaluable historical sources despite their disturbing origins. Archaeological evidence supports historical records of verification practices through discoveries of specialized furniture, architectural features, and personal items associated with marriage ceremonies. These physical remains confirm that verification was as widespread and institutionalized as documentary sources suggest. Comparative analysis with other cultures reveals that marriage verification wasn't unique to medieval Europe, though European practices were particularly elaborate and well documented. Similar customs existed in various forms across different societies, suggesting that public validation of marriage has deep anthropological roots. The complete transformation from public verification to private intimacy represents one of the most significant changes in human social organization. We've moved from a world where the most intimate aspects of human life were subject to public observation and legal documentation, to one where such intrusion would be considered criminal assault. Modern marriage practices retain ceremonial elements that echo verification traditions while eliminating the invasive observation that characterized medieval procedures. Wedding ceremonies still include witnesses, official documentation, and legal validation, but these elements focus on consent and commitment rather than physical performance. Legal marriage requirements today emphasize mutual consent, legal capacity, and proper documentation while completely eliminating physical evidence requirements. The idea that marriage validity could depend on witnessed sexual performance seems barbaric to contemporary sensibilities. Privacy rights that we consider fundamental and natural are actually recent historical developments that required centuries of social evolution. The expectation that intimate relationships should be free from external observation represents a revolutionary change from historical norms. Gender equality in modern marriage contrasts sharply with medieval verification practices that subjected women to humiliating examination while emphasizing male performance and control. Contemporary marriage emphasizes partnership and mutual respect rather than ownership and domination. Medical privacy protections ensure that sexual health and performance remain confidential between patients and healthcare providers rather than becoming matters of public record and legal documentation. The medicalization of sexuality has shifted from public verification to private treatment. The transformation of marriage from political alliance to personal relationship eliminated the economic and diplomatic pressures that made verification seem necessary to medieval society. When marriages no longer determine territorial control or inheritance disputes, public validation becomes unnecessary. Looking back at Eleanor de Montfort in her cold stone chamber, surrounded by witnesses preparing to observe and document her most intimate moments, we can appreciate how completely our concepts of privacy, dignity, and personal autonomy have evolved. Her terror wasn't just personal anxiety about performance. It was the weight of an entire social system that treated human sexuality as public property. The candlelight still flickers across the faces of those who will judge her performance, but now we understand that this moment represents more than individual trauma. It embodies a worldview where privacy didn't exist, where the most personal aspects of human experience were subject to public scrutiny and legal documentation. Medieval verification practices remind us that privacy isn't a natural human condition, but a hard-won social achievement that required centuries of struggle against systems of control and observation. The bedroom became private only after society recognized that some aspects of human experience are too intimate for public consumption. The witnesses surrounding Eleanor's bed represent not just individual voyeurs, but an entire civilization that hadn't yet developed concepts of personal boundaries, individual rights, or intimate privacy. Their presence was legal necessity, not personal choice in a world where marriage was too important to be left to private discretion. Understanding these practices helps us recognize how recent and fragile our modern concepts of privacy actually are. The idea that intimate relationships should be free from external observation represents a revolutionary change that we often take for granted. The horror of medieval verification practices serves as a reminder that social progress isn't inevitable, and that rights we consider fundamental can be lost if we don't actively protect them. The transformation from public verification to private intimacy required conscious effort by countless individuals who recognized the importance of personal dignity and autonomy. Eleanor's story, multiplied across thousands of noble families throughout medieval Europe, represents both the worst aspects of historical social control and the human resilience that eventually overcame such invasive practices. Her suffering contributed to a gradual recognition that some aspects of human experience must remain private to preserve basic human dignity. The next time you close your bedroom door and expect privacy, remember that this simple act represents centuries of social evolution and countless struggles for personal autonomy. What seems natural and obvious to us would have seemed impossible to medieval society. If this exploration of history's hidden invasions of privacy has transformed your understanding of how personal rights developed over time, subscribing ensures you'll continue accessing these revelations about how human dignity was gradually recognized and protected. Your curiosity about the real human experience behind historical social structures deserves to be fed. And there are many more stories of both oppression and liberation waiting to be told. The transformation from public humiliation to private dignity represents one of humanity's greatest achievements. And understanding that journey helps us appreciate and protect the freedoms we often take for granted today.